So without further ado, we have another historical perspective or lessons from a life past today. And the person who will be sharing this with us is Terry Kerber. Terry is a lifelong resident of Excelsior and a partner at Retirement Advisory Investment Group in Eden Prairie. He and his brother, Conrad Kerber, spent 5 years piecing together the life story of Marshall Major Taylor. With over 1,000 sources from America, Europe, and Australia, their book is the most comprehensive biography ever written on Major Taylor, a fascinating athlete who, from 1896 to 1910, captivated millions of people all over the world. Please join me in welcoming Terry Kerber.
Well, thank you, Rotary, for having me. The Nobel Prize winning author Maya Angelou once said, "There's no greater agony in life than bearing an untold story inside you." And sadly, that agony was once common to many historically significant African Americans whose life stories often went untold, let alone published. And this is the story of one of the greatest legends America ever forgot. Our hope is that everyone who would read our book would come away with something that opens their eyes and inspires them into a part of our history that at one time captivated millions of Americans, Europeans, and Australians. Well, Marshall Taylor was born in 1878 in Indianapolis, and his father worked as a coachman for a wealthy Indianapolis railroad family. Marshall became best friends with their son, whose parents saw to it that both boys were clothed, fed, privately tutored, and maybe most importantly, had bicycles. When Marshall was around 13 years old, he landed a job at a local bicycle shop where the owner, to attract interest of passing horse carriages, shoot him out into the street wearing a military costume, and that's where, according to one legend, someone first uttered the name Major. And then that nickname would stick with him until his death, and between the years 1896 to 1910, create headlines in newspapers that were read all over the world. Well, I'd like to briefly paint a picture of this era that he lived in. As hard as it is for us to imagine today, between the years 1870 and 1900, before automobiles, the main form of transportation for most Americans was by horse, or if you were lucky enough to own one, a bicycle. But before being widely accepted, cyclists were loathed by the horsemen at that time, which caused a bitter feud that lasted about 3 decades. In fact, the term that we use today, road rage, did not start between the cars and the bicycles. It started between the dominant form of transportation, which were the horsemen, and these newfangled wheelmen. Well, during this period, newspapers were snowed under with bicycle-related advertisement and commentary dealing with every aspect of this sport and recreation. 1893 was the first year that Americans bought more bicycles than horses, and 1/3 of all patents in that year were bicycle related. Barbers spoke of bicycles during your haircuts, doctors during your exam, and preachers during their sermons. Bicycles influenced clothing fashions, and politicians even ran on platforms that were friendly to the wheelmen. Well, the biggest issue on Taylor's mind at that time in our history was the racial environment. In his youth, he was denied access to the local Indianapolis YMCA, and segregation in trains, schools, restaurants, bathrooms, in fact, any public place was the norm. And if you were an elite athlete in these days, what were your options? Well, there was no professional football, basketball, hockey, golf, or tennis leagues. And lots of people played those sports, but they were not the organized versions that come to your mind when we talk about it today. And then in 1896, to make matters more complicated, the Supreme Court passed the landmark Plessy versus Ferguson case, which made an already very hostile racial environment that much worse. And it was within a month of that legislation that Major Taylor turned 18 years old and began his professional career. I know that Rotary is very big on mentoring, and if there was ever a phenomenal mentor, an influential mentor in Taylor's life, it was this man, Bertie Munger. Well, Munger was a former washed-up racer who made a lot of money, and he parlayed his winnings into a very prosperous racing bicycle company. And when Taylor was around 14 years old, he went to not only work for Munger, but he went to live with Munger in his home. And Munger took a lot of heat in Indianapolis for kind of partnering up with this young African-American boy from his business partners, and decided, in fact, not just heat, but to be more specific, threats. So he decided the safer thing to do would be to move off to a more racially tolerant area of the United States, in this case, Worcester, Massachusetts, and that's where they moved. He saw enormous potential in this young, about 13, 14-year-old African-American kid. Well, beyond that, another very important character that will be in the book is William Brady, and Brady was a real joy to write about. Brady was a preeminent sports promoter of those days. He basically controlled Madison Square Garden, and he wrote about 600 plays, produced 600 plays on Broadway. And Brady stood up for, he actually, by the way, it was the manager of the heavyweight boxing champion in the world, Jim Corbett. And Brady stood up for Major Taylor. Taylor was not allowed to join the League of American Wheelmen. So Brady came to his aid and got him accepted, and then negotiated some of his future racing contracts. In fact, the best analogy of William Brady here is to say that he was for Major Taylor what Branch Rickey was for Jackie Robinson 50 years later. Well, Brady and his very wealthy business partners controlled velodromes in New York City, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. And you can see by this photo that some of these stadiums had as many as 25,000 seats. They had billiard rooms. They had 60-piece orchestras to entertain the huge crowds. In fact, one very detailed report at the end of 1897 in the New York Times concluded that that year, over 8 million spectators paid to watch bicycle races. In fact, at the League of American Wheelmen convention, which was in Philadelphia that year, over 50,000 Americans attended, and that was the largest paying crowd for any sporting event in American history. Well, this sport that I'm talking about of track racing was not the 100-plus miles a day that we think of today with the Tour de France. This was velodrome track racing, where the 1- and 2-mile disciplines were the most common. And traveling at 45 miles an hour on a steeply banked track was fast, dangerous, and deadly. Between the years 1890 and 1920, 47 bicycle racers were killed on these tracks, and thousands of others were hurt very badly. In fact, William Brady, who I introduced a moment ago, who knew the sport better than anybody, wrote in one of his autobiographies, "Take a spill off a speeding bicycle on a hardwood track, and you would have been better off that day if you just woke up and took one of Joe Louis's punches." So it was a sport that was usually chewing them up and spitting them out in a hurry. But you'll hear shortly why they were the highest paid athletes in the world by far. Well, Taylor here, when he was a young 18-year-old kid, actually near his birthday, he underwent an adult baptism at the John Street Baptist Church in Worcester. And from that moment on, until the day the day he died, he and his Bible were inseparable. And he carried it with him everywhere he went, and he made a promise, actually, to honor a promise that he had made to his mother before this, and she had passed away, but he said, I promise you I will never race on Sundays. And back then, that was when the big races were held, were on Sundays. And it turns out that his stance against Sunday racing would become the currency with which he would express his views of the world, and eventually get entire nations to bend to his will. Well, despite having great difficulties getting a hotel or a meal in American cities when he traveled and competed, Taylor began to win everything in sight, and he set numerous world records that would withstand decades and thousands of assaults. His name, combined with a marketing blitz, could mean the difference of a crowd of maybe 8,000 to 10,000 to as many as 40 to 60,000 people. In 1899, when he won the World Championship in Montreal, his drawing power helped pull in over 45,000 fans, which was the largest paying crowd in Montreal's sports history. Well, as early as 1899, when Taylor was 21 years old, he began receiving offers for as much as $15,000 to race in Europe for 3 months. And because they all required that he would race on Sundays, he declined them all. And just to wrap your head around this number, Ty Cobb did not sign a $15,000 baseball contract until 16 years later. Okay? Well, the average American, by the way, in 1899 here, made around $300 to $500 a year. So in effect, he's turning down more money for 3 months than the average American would have made in a 30 to 40-year working career. Well, in the year 1900, Taylor dominated the American racing season, and he finished that season with twice as many points as his nearest competitor, Frank Kramer, who the newspapers, including the New York Times, is writing was going to be the next great white hope. So when you've heard that term, it didn't start with the boxers, it started right here with Taylor. Well, promoters continued to believe that by opening their deep pocketbooks, it would be easier to change the habits of one African-American man who had a hard time getting a hotel or a meal in American cities than it would be to change the habits of millions of people in Europe. And they were wrong. And after 3 years of intense negotiations, finally, the European promoters caved in, and they signed Taylor to a non-Sunday 3-month spring racing contract calling for him to race in the countries all over Europe. You can still hear the people cheering 100-plus years later here. Well, the most intriguing part of this contract, and this was something why it took 3 years, and something that became an international obsession, in fact, this was widely remembered all over Europe a quarter century after it happened, was the match race that happened between Major Taylor and the man in the photo, Edmond Jacquelin. In 1901, Jacquelin was a Frenchman who had won the Grand Prix of Paris, his second French national championship, and the 1900 World Championship. And he was a skilled boxer and a former soldier, and he was known to be athletically incorrigible and arrogant. So in this match race, it was America versus France, black versus white, humble versus brash, coming together for what, according to numerous sources, was the most heavily advertised sporting event in history. Well, the promoters were worried that people were not going to show up for non-Sunday racing. Before Taylor's visit to Paris, the average day's circulation of Le Velo was around 25,000 copies a day. In a handful of days before and immediately after this match race, over 750,000 copies of Le Velo alone were sold. And the money, betting was allowed, the money that was bet on this race was a world record. William K. Vanderbilt, who owned the first Madison Square Garden, William Thaw, who was a railroad tycoon, and Harry Moore, who was a gold rush millionaire, all bet $20,000 on the outcome of this race that was 1 kilometer long, and it was about to take less than 2 minutes. The Parc des Princes track that you see in the photo here, which was later used in the Paris Olympics, at this time had a capacity of 18,000 people. And on this day, they had 28,000 people. They filled the stands. They put another 10,000 people into the infield. And then they turned away about 5,000 more people who were going to pay top dollar to get in to see what was about to happen here. And of course, it was amazing that even though there were that many hysterical fans at the start of that race, one reporter wrote, "It was so quiet, one would have thought that only one man was a spectator. The silence was sublime." And of course, this is the part where people want to know who won the race, but I don't tell you. You have to buy the book and read it just to find out. Well, when Taylor was in Europe, he stayed at the finest hotels, he ate at the nicest restaurants, and he was sought after by the business leaders who were constantly throwing calling cards his way to get his endorsements on their products. But it was the freedom from bigotry that he cherished the most, because barring a few minor exceptions, from the moment he put his foot on European soil, the bitter racism that was at the basis of his daily existence in America had been checked at the ocean's edge. So for the Aussie in our room here, Harry, this is another character that plays into Taylor's life in a big way right about this time in 1901. This larger-than-life character is Australian promoter Huge Deal McIntosh. And McIntosh got his nickname Huge Deal when he arranged, managed, and he refereed the heavyweight boxing championship between Jack Johnson and Tommy Burns in Sydney. McIntosh knew in order to lure Taylor all the way to Australia, it was going to have to come up with something spectacular, and he did. He and his wealthy syndicate partners with Sydney Summer Nights Amusements created the richest cycling purse in history. Well, Taylor had recently married, and he used this trip as an opportunity for him and his wife, Daisy, to experience a royal honeymoon. And such was his reputation that before they even arrived, the transit authorities in Sydney arranged the anticipated unprecedented world record attendance here. They arranged special Major Taylor Carnival trains to accommodate these hundreds of thousands of people they knew would pay to watch him race. And here's another great photo here, and this is still there in Sydney. This is the Sydney Cricket Grounds today, but the Sydney Velodrome here was the most modern in the world. And much of this concrete track, which is 3 laps to the mile, was surrounded by grandstands, bars, restaurants, a separate smokers pavilion, a ladies pavilion, a members only section, and a shilling pavilion. This was a 35,000 seat racing Xanadu that gave bicycle races at that time the same look and feel we get today when we tune into the Kentucky Derby. I mean, it was a very formal event, beautiful dresses and the bonnets and all of that. And when Taylor's name was advertised, gates of 50 to 60,000 were commonplace. In fact, in a very brief series of races in Sydney, over 250,000 people attended, and that was half of the entire population of Sydney, Australia at that time. Well, Taylor's 1903 racing season in Australia was astonishing. Before he left America, he received a contract which guaranteed him about the equivalent of $2.4 million in today's money. And just to give you, and that was about 4,000 pounds in those days. And just to give you context, the second highest earner in Australia that year made 400 pounds to his 4,000, and the third highest earner, 200 pounds. So in addition to this guaranteed contract, win, lose, or draw, he won 23 out of 27 races over a 4-month racing period, and essentially he cleaned out the banks in Australia and left very little money on the table for any other professionals, and there were professionals there from all over the world because it was the richest cycling purse in history. Well, after that winter contract was up, Taylor and his wife Daisy left for Europe and to pile on to their bank account. And that year, the World Championships were held in Rome, Italy on a Sunday. So promoters knew he would not participate, but just to make it clear, they arranged several match races between Taylor and the eventual winner, Thor Ellegaard, who was from Denmark. And the day after that event, Lavello wrote that Major Taylor just literally annihilated the freshly crowned world champion. Well, it was estimated in the year 1903 and 1904 that Major Taylor, at that time, made between $40,000 and $50,000, which would be the equivalent of several million dollars in today's money. And again, I mentioned Ty Cobb earlier, but Babe Ruth did not sign a $20,000 contract until 1920. So here's an African American with the difficulty getting a hotel or meal in America, making twice as much money in 1903 than Babe Ruth makes after 6 years of playing Major League Baseball. By this point in Taylor's 8-year career, it is very likely that he had made more money and attracted more paying fans than any other athlete in any sport anywhere in the world. Well, in 1904, the Australian champion, who's in the lower photo here, accompanied the Taylors back from Australia with a little baby girl named Sydney. And so she's 2 months old. But unfortunately, in San Francisco in 1904, racism wasn't just prevalent, it was city policy, and they were, due to the color line, they were denied access immediately to any bus or train. They tried 4 or 5 restaurants and had to give it up. And they tried hotels, and that was out of the question, so they basically boarded the train back to Worcester, Massachusetts, which caused the Australian champion to say, boy, from what I've seen in short order here, I'm not sure what it was you were boasting about for months and months in Australia. Well, Taylor ended up living his life in two extremes. One where he was feted and praised in these countries all over the world, and the other where he dealt with what he called the monster prejudice that was very prevalent at that time. Well, he had suffered the worst injury of his career in 1904, and he after a 3-year absence, he returned to Europe to settle a lawsuit against him. He was supposed to go back, and he broke the contract. He went back just to settle the contract, and he had 6 races he had to fulfill, and he did, and he lost all 6. And then he said to his wife, "Do you want to go home?" And she said, "No." He was back in his form, and he went on from that point, and he annihilated all the champions, the old guys and the young guys alike, twice, just to make it really clear who was really the champion. And then finally, in the last days of his life, he found himself in the Depression in Chicago, living at a colored YMCA up here. And the brief little history on that YMCA is it was the first African-American YMCA in the North. And a few years before Taylor arrived, another historian, Carter Woodson, stated that same why, and it was Carter Woodson who formed the idea that if whites learned more about blacks, race relations would improve. So Woodson started Black History Month in 1926. And he chose February because it contains the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and most importantly, Valentine's Day, a day of love and affection. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to tell the Taylor story. Yeah, and I'm going to be staying for, if we have time for a couple questions, I'd be happy to. No, we don't. Yeah, I'll be up here at the end. Questions.
Thank you so much. Stay up here for just a minute.
Sure.
I would like to give you, in appreciation of speaking today, I would like to present you with this certificate, and a donation to End Polio will be made in your name to End Polio Now, the signature project of Rotary International. In the early 1980s, there were about 400,000 cases of polio in the world each year, and Rotary decided to join with other organizations to lead the eradication of polio in the world. We are so close to eradicating this devastating disease. In 2015, we've had 33 cases, limited to 2 countries. Success over polio will help fuel the energy for what people in the world can do when we work together.
Great
So
cause.
here's a certificate for you, and here is a End Polio Now.
Thank you.
pin.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Great
much.
cause.